Good evening. Let's read some more. I like to watch the early evening news in 50 minutes on the Danish TV. But I think we can finish this in less 50 minutes. So did read about the Torah, or the five Moses books. So that's the first book of the Torah. I'm reading this in my language Danish, so I like to read it before I read more tonight.
Book of Genesis. The Book of Genesis, from Greek, Genesis, Biblical Hebrew, Romanized, Bia. Lit. In the beginning, Latin, Liber Genesis, is the first book of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament. 1. Its Hebrew name is the same as its first word, Bereshit, in the beginning. Genesis is an account of the creation of the world, the early history of humanity, and the origins of the Jewish people. 2. Tradition credits Moses as the author of Genesis, as well as the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and most of Deuteronomy. However, modern scholars, especially from the 19th century onward, place the book's authorship in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, hundreds of years after Moses is supposed to have lived. 3. 4. Based on scientific interpretation of archaeological, genetic, and linguistic evidence, most mainstream Bible scholars consider Genesis to be primarily mythological rather than historical. It is divisible into two parts: the primeval history, chapters 1:11, and the ancestral history, chapters 12:50. 5. The primeval history sets out the author's concepts of the nature of the deity and of humankind's relationship with its maker. God creates a world which is good and fit for humans. But when man corrupts it with sin, God decides to destroy his creation, sparing only the righteous Noah and his family to re-establish relationship between man and God. 6. The ancestral history, chapters 12:50, tells of the prehistory of Israel, God's chosen people. 7. At God's command, Noah's descendant Abraham journeys from his birthplace, described as Ur of the Chaldeans and whose identification with Sumerian Ur is tentative in modern scholarship, into the God-given land of Canaan, where he dwells as a sojourner, as does his son Isaac and his grandson Jacob. Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and through the agency of his son Joseph, the children of Israel descend into Egypt, 70 people in all with their households, and God promised him a future of greatness. Genesis ends with Israel in Egypt, ready for the coming of Moses and the Exodus, departure. The narrative is punctuated by a series of covenants with God, successively narrowing in scope from all humankind. The covenant with Noah, to a special relationship with one people alone, Abraham and his descendants through Isaac and Jacob. 8. In Judaism, the theological importance of Genesis centers on the covenants linking God to his chosen people and the people to the promised land. Title: The Creation of Man by Ephraim Moses Lillian, 1903. The name Genesis is from the Latin Vulgate, in turn borrowed or transliterated from Greek, meaning origin, Biblical Hebrew, Romanized, Bia, in the beginning. 9. Composition. For much of the 20th century, most scholars agreed that the 5 books of the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy, came from 4 sources: the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist and the priestly source. Known as the documentary hypothesis, each source was held to tell the same basic story, with the sources later joined together by various editors. 10. Since the 1970s, However, there has been a revolution in this line of thought, leading scholars to view the Elohist source as no more than a variation on the Yahwist, and the priestly source as a body of revisions and expansions to the Yahwist, or non-priestly, material. The Deuteronomistic source does not appear in Genesis. 11. Scholars use examples of repeated and duplicate stories to identify separate sources. In Genesis, these include 3 different accounts of a patriarch claiming that his wife was his sister, the 2 creation stories and the 2 versions of Abraham sending Hagar and Ishmael into the desert. 12. This leaves the question of when these works were created. Scholars in the first half of the 20th century concluded that the Yahwist source was a product of the monarchic period, specifically at the court of Solomon, 10th century BC, and the priestly work a product of the middle of the 5th century BC, with claims that the author was Ezra. However, more recent thinking is that the Yahwist source dates to from either just before or during the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BC, and that the priestly final edition was made late in the exilic period or soon after. 4. The almost complete absence of all the characters and incidents mentioned in primeval history from the rest of the Hebrew Bible has led a sizable minority of scholars to conclude that these chapters were composed much later than those that follow, possibly in the 3rd century BC. 13. By comparing Dead Sea level indications in chapter 14 of Genesis, Amos, Frumkin and Elixir suggests the composition dating between 1500 and 1200 BC. 14. As for why the book was created, a theory which has gained considerable interest, although still controversial, is that of Persian imperial authorization. This proposes that the Persians of the Achaemenid Empire, after their conquest of Babylon in 539 BC, agreed to grant Jerusalem a large measure of local autonomy within the empire, but required the local authorities to produce a single law code accepted by the entire community. The 2 powerful groups making up the community, the priestly families who controlled the Second Temple and who traced their origin to Moses and the wilderness wanderings, and the major landowning families who made up the elders and who traced their own origins to Abraham, who had given them the land, were in conflict over many issues, and each had its own history of origins. However, the Persian promise of greatly increased local autonomy for all provided a powerful incentive to cooperate in producing a single text. 15. Genre. Genesis is an example of a work in the antiquities genre, as the Romans knew it, a popular genre telling of the appearance of humans and their ancestors and heroes, with elaborate genealogies and chronologies fleshed out with stories and anecdotes. 16. The most notable examples are found in the work of Greek historians of the 6th century BC. Their intention was to connect notable families of their own day to a distant and heroic past, and in doing so they did not distinguish between myth, legend, and facts. 17. Professor Jean-Louis Scar of the Pontifical Biblical Institute calls the basic rule of the antiquarian historian the law of conservation: everything old is valuable, nothing is eliminated. 18. This antiquity was needed to prove the author of Israel's traditions to the nations, the neighbors of the Jews in the early Persian province of Judea, and to reconcile and unite the various factions within Israel itself. 18. Describing the work of the biblical authors, John Van Setters wrote that lacking many historical traditions and none from the distant past, they had to use myths and legends for earlier periods. In order to make sense out of the variety of different and often conflicting versions of stories, and to relate the stories to each other, they fitted them into a genealogical chronology. 19. Textual witnesses. There are 4 major textual witnesses to the book: the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, and fragments of Genesis found at Qumran. The Qumran group provides the oldest manuscripts but covers only a small proportion of the book. In general, the Masortic text is well preserved and reliable, but there are many individual instances where the other versions preserve a superior reading. 20. Structure. Genesis appears to be structured around the recurring phrase El Toledo, meaning these are the generations, with the first use of the phrase referring to the generations of heaven and earth and the remainder marking individuals Noah, the sons of Noah, Shem, etc., down to Jacob. 21. The Toledo formula, occurring 11 times in the book of Genesis, delineating its sections and shaping its structure, serves as a heading which marks a transition to a new subject. Genesis 1:1, narrative, in the beginning. Genesis 2:4, narrative, Toledo of heaven and earth. Genesis 5:1, genealogy, Toledo of Adam. Genesis 6:9, narrative, Toledo of Noah. Genesis 10:1, genealogy, Toledo of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Genesis 11:10, genealogy, Toledo of Shem. Genesis 11:27, narrative, Toledo of Track. Genesis 25:12, genealogy, Toledo of Ishmael. Genesis 25:19, narrative, Toledo of Isaac. Genesis 36:1 and 36:9, genealogy, Toledo of Esau. Genesis 37:2, narrative, Toledo of Jacob. 22:23. It is not clear, however, what this meant to the original authors, and most modern commentators divide it into two parts based on the subject matter: a primeval history, chapters 1:11, and a patriarchal history, chapters 12:50. 24a. While the first is far shorter than the second, it sets out the basic themes and provides an interpretive key for understanding the entire book. 25. The primeval history has a symmetrical structure hinging on chapters 6-9, the flood story, with the events before the flood mirrored by the events after. Winking sad smiley. 26. The ancestral history is structured around the three patriarchs Abraham, Jacob and Joseph. 27. The stories of Isaac do not make up a coherent cycle of stories and function as a bridge between the cycles of Abraham and Jacob. 28. Summary. Primeval history, chapters 1:11. The creation of Adam by Michelangelo, 1512. The Genesis creation narrative comprises two different stories. First two chapters roughly correspond to these. 29. In the first, Elohim, the generic Hebrew word for God, creates the heavens and earth including humankind, in 6 days, and rests on these events. In the second, God, now referred to as Yahweh Elohim, rendered as the Lord God in English translations, creates two individuals, Adam and Eve, as the first man and woman, and places them in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden with the Fall of Man by Jan Bruel the Elder and Pieter Paul Rubens, c. 1615, depicting both domestic and exotic wild animals such as tigers, parrots and ostriches coexisting in the garden. Noah's Ark, 1846, by the American folk painter Edward Hicks. In the third chapter, God instructs them not to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They promise not to, but a talking serpent, portrayed as a deceptive creature or trickster, convinces Eve to eat the fruit against God's wishes, and she convinces Adam, whereupon God throws them out and curses both of them. Adam was cursed with getting what he needs only by sweat and work, and Eve to giving birth in pain. This is interpreted by Christians as the fall of man into sin. Eve bears two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain works in the garden, and Abel works with meat. They both offer offerings to God one day, and God does not accept Cain's offering but does accept Abel's. This causes Cain to resent Abel, and Cain ends up murdering him. God then curses Cain. Eve bears another son, Seth, to take Abel's place. After many generations of Adam have passed from the lines of Cain and Seth, the world becomes corrupted by human sin and Nephilim, and God wants to wipe out humanity for their wickedness. However, Noah is the only good human, so first, He instructs the righteous Noah and his family to build an ark and put examples of all the animals on it, 7 pairs of every clean animal and 1 pair